Hi, everyone. Today we have our first session with Sami Mian. He's the business development in APAC for Hedera Hashgraph, and he will be talking about the journey of Hedera Hashgraph. And there is a topic that we'll be talking about, Sami, right?
That's right, yeah. So I'll be talking about tokenization specifically.
Yes.
And how we think this year tokenization is really going to take off.
Yeah, perfect. Looking forward, Sami. Over to you now.
Great.
Yeah.
Can I just share my screen if you
Yes,
can?
let me just allow you to. Yeah, can you try now?
Yep.
Yeah, perfect.
Great. Okay, so thank you everybody for listening in. It's a pleasure. Thank you for Octaloop for inviting us to speak about tokenization. My name is Sami. I'm head of Asia Pacific for Hedera Hashgraph. And as Anupam was saying, so the topic today is a topic that is really close to my heart personally, and also what Hedera is really focused on, which is tokenization. We think this year, tokenization is really going to start to emanate in the distributed ledger technology market. And 2023 and 22, 23 is also going to be a year that we're going to see some explosive development in the space. So Hedera Hashgraph is enterprise grade ledger. What that means is from day one, when Dr. Baird, the inventor of Hashgraph, and also our co-founder, started developing the consensus algorithm in 2012, our question was, how can we get enterprise adoption of public distributed ledgers? This has always been a problem in the space. When Bitcoin came out, when blockchain started to become more and more well-known, when Ethereum came on board, we still really haven't seen the biggest and most trusted enterprises start using the public DLT space. A lot of development has happened in the private ledger space. We've had multiple companies launch on Hyperledger Fabric. There's been Corda use cases, Quorum, other public uses, private ledger uses, but public ledger really hasn't seen the kind of adoption from the enterprise market. And that is the problem that Hedera Hashgraph has been trying to address from day one. And we identified 4 aspects, reasons why we think that enterprises haven't adopted public ledgers. And the reasons are, the first reason we identified was an obvious one: performance. So enterprises, especially the biggest enterprises, need tens of thousands of transactions per second, and also seconds in finality, as opposed to tens, maybe 20 transactions per second, which is generally the kind of speed that was available by the first and second generation ledgers. So Hedera Hashgraph and also some of the other third generation ledgers have addressed this problem of performance. There also were some security issues with the first and second generation ledgers, specifically that there's no finality. In other words, that if there's a transaction that is happening on, let's say, Bitcoin, blockchain, or Ethereum, you never get to a point where the transaction is 100% final. You always get maybe 99.9999%, but you will never get that finality. And that has also been a problem for enterprises to adopt the technology. Another problem that we have been addressing is the problem of stability. Stability means that essentially networks keep on forking. And for a large enterprise to be able to comfortably build an application on a public ledger, we have to make sure that the ledger does not fork. And finally, governance. So governance means who decides and how do they decide what needs to be changed. Initially, we, the team at Hedera, is building the ledger, but over time, certain decisions need to be made. For example, do we need to change the technical roadmap? Do we need to align with certain regulations that are coming on board? And these decisions need to be made in a way that provides comfort, transparency, and credibility to the ledger. So, as I mentioned, we had first generation ledgers, Bitcoin in 2009. Then we had Ethereum coming out around 2014. And now you see the third and fourth generation ledgers. And Hedera Hashgraph is, we'd like to call ourselves the third generation ledger that addresses a lot of the problems that the previous ledgers were not able to address. And specific to today's talk, we address a problem that needs to be addressed in order for tokenization to really take off. And that is the problem of fairness. So the other ledgers in the market had not been able to address this problem satisfactorily. And Hedera has some unique functions within its consensus algorithm that addresses the fairness, which we think is a requirement for tokenization to really take off. Hedera also, as I mentioned, in terms of governance, is governed by the biggest companies in the world. From India, we have companies like Wipro, we have Tata Communications. From the Middle East, we have Zain. From Korea, we have LG, the US, IBM, Boeing. From Africa, we have biggest bank in Africa, Standard Bank, Deutsche Telekom. From Japan, where I am presenting you this from, we have Nomura Holdings, FPOS from Australia. As you can see, we've gone out and we've partnered up with the biggest companies in the world in different industries from different jurisdictions. And the reason is because we want companies from different geographies and different industries to feed back to the platform the necessities and the problems that need to be solved in order for there to be really scaling of enterprise adoption. So that was a quick introduction on Hedera. Now on to the topic of the day, which is tokenization. So when I started in the industry, it was about 2016. One of the reasons why I was so attracted by the industry was because of the promise of tokenization. I remember watching a TED Talk, and I can't remember who it was, but I remember that gentleman saying, the day is coming when you can walk into a coffee shop, let's say Starbucks, and pay for a coffee using a piece of your real estate or maybe a piece of your stock. And that line just, triggered something in me. I was like, this is the most fascinating thing I've heard in a very, very long time. The idea that everything in this world can be tokenized and you don't need to convert everything in cash in order to move across asset classes. For example, you can go directly from real estate to stocks. You can go from stocks to, let's say, goods and services. You can go from any asset class without going through fiat into each other. And because my background was in finance, I just found that so fascinating. That being said, it's been about 4 years since I've been in the industry, and it's really hard to say if this promise of tokenization, the idea that I can go into a Starbucks and pay for a coffee using my real estate portfolio, if it really has been delivered. There's been other people in the industry. For example, Robert Grayfield, who's the former chairman and CEO of NASDAQ, who this is last year said that 100% of the stocks and bonds trading on Wall Street today could be tokenized. And in 5 years, 100% of the stock and bonds on Wall Street will be tokenized. So there's been a lot of promises about tokenization. And before I go on to really explain if this promise has been delivered, I think it's important that we level set and really define what tokenization means. So tokenization essentially is the process of converting real assets, and it can also be digital assets, and converting them into tokens, and essentially providing ownership rights to the person that owns the tokens, and also provide provenance. In other words, the ownership of the token recorded on a distributed ledger. So I'll give you an example. The other day, I actually sold one of my real estates in Japan, and it took about a month and a half from the day that the buyer wanted to buy the piece of real estate to the money being transferred into my bank account. And there were so many parties involved. And most of it, and this is Japan, the third largest economy in the world, you would imagine that everything is done, digitally, and everything is done so efficiently. But the truth of the matter is that so many things are still done by pen and paper. And what asset tokenization would be able to do is essentially put all of the information regarding that piece of real estate, also where that real estate has been, who owned it in the past, and represent that ownership as a token. So if I wanted to sell that piece of real estate to somebody else, then essentially I would be able to do it on a smartphone, hopefully press my fingerprint once decentralized ID functions are embedded. And then the token is transferred over to the buyer. And the money that was held in escrow would be transferred in my bank. So this could realistically be done in literally a few minutes. And that's really the promise of asset tokenization. So asset tokenization can provide increased liquidity, for example, in terms of a real estate. I don't have to sell it to one person. I can break down the units of the real estate into, let's say, 1 rupee or 10 rupees and sell it to the mass public. It also, as I mentioned, reduces costs, and settlement is way faster than it takes right now, especially for high value items. Now, in terms of, has this promise really been delivered? Right? The reason why I got into industry, the promise of tokenization. So let's see the size of the tokenization market in 2020. So as you can see, the cryptocurrency, let me just see, there we go, laser pointer, here we go. So the cryptocurrency tokens right now is about 40 billion, right? There's 18 billion of stable coins out there, 18 billion of exchange traded funds. And real estate, what I was talking about, is only $130 million worth of real estate has been tokenized to date. So what does that mean? Is that a lot? Is that, is that really minuscule? Let's compare this to the entire cryptocurrency market. So let's see. Currently, the cryptocurrency market is about $1.5 trillion. I had to update this actually this morning because day by day, as we know, the cryptocurrency market becomes bigger and bigger. But Bitcoin's market cap has reached about $1 trillion. Ethereum is about 200 billion, and everything else is about 300 billion. So let's compare it to the tokenized market. Right? The tokenized market is way smaller, even compared to the crypto market. And crypto market, $1.5 trillion is decent. It's said that there's about $10 trillion worth of gold above ground, and Bitcoin has gotten to about 1/10 of that. So we're on our way. But remember what Robert Greenfield said. He said that he sees all stocks and bonds being tokenized. And so let's just take stocks for a moment. The stock market is about $110 trillion. And so the crypto being 1.5 and the tokenized market being even smaller than that, we have a long, long way to go before we even start talking about the global stock market. And if you include gold and real estate and all assets, then we are just right at the beginning. So the promise of tokenization has been made since the early days of distributed ledgers. But as I mentioned, it really hasn't been delivered. And we think the reason is because there's been 5 issues that really need to be overcome before tokenization really takes off. And a lot of these problems have been started to be addressed this year. And that's the reason why we think that 2001 indeed will be the year that we look back upon and be like, yeah, 2021 is the year where tokenization really did take off. The 5 challenges that have so far caused tokenization to stall, first of all, is the fluctuation in transaction fees. So I also am sometimes involved in some decentralized finance applications on Ethereum or some of the other ledgers. And I can't but notice the transaction fees become so expensive when the network becomes congested. The other day, I tried to unlock some tokens from a DeFi application, and it would have costed me $60 to unlock $1,000 worth of value. And that is a lot, right? And I've seen it gone up to about $200-$300 for a transaction. So we really need to address the fluctuation in transaction fees. Now, if you're talking about $1 million worth of real estate, then maybe $50, $100 is not that much. But the real promise of tokenization, I believe, comes from us facilitating the inclusion of people who have been ousted by the financial markets. And these involves, small deals, $100, $200, and also including microtransactions. So this fluctuation in transaction fees, this point really needs to be addressed. And Hedera, as I can explain later, has addressed this point. Some other challenges are slow performance. And this is obvious. You have a credit card provider that needs hundreds of thousands of transactions at the peak. Even in normal circumstances, you'll need about 30,000 transactions per second. And so 10, 20, 30, even 1,000 transactions per second is not really going to cut it for an enterprise use case. The third point is constant threat of network forking. And this is important, especially for asset tokenization. I brought up real estate. If the deed of the real estate is on one ledger, and then the ledger forks to another competing ledger, then this causes a lot of instability. Where does the deed lie? Who actually owns the real estate? And then we're back to what we were trying to solve in the first place, which is clarity, which is stability, which is provenance. And the fourth point is really the uncertain regulatory environment. And to an extent, this has started to be addressed. For example, the OCC in the US announced that now banks can actually run nodes. And this is a big development. In the past, we had financial institutions that were not so sure about being able to participate in public ledgers. But with the regulator coming out and saying that they can, this has caused a lot of reverse inquiries. We've been hearing from banks almost on a monthly basis, and specifically for the use cases regarding tokenization of financial assets. And finally, a lack of accessibility of for existing technology platforms. So these challenges were the reason why, up until now, tokenization only addresses a very, very small part of the asset market. And just to compare, let's say, ourselves to Ethereum, we have performance that we believe we have overcome. In other words, Ethereum might have 20 transactions per second. Hedera does thousands of transactions per second, up to 10,000 transactions or more. We have predictable cost. In other words, our cost is a dollar fixed amount. So regardless of how big of a ticket, regardless of how many transactions you do, each transaction is going to cost, currently it's 1/10 of a penny, but that cost is, or predictable cost is crucial for any enterprise to be able to tokenized assets. Stable governance. This is one of the differentiating features of Hedera, in that each ledger has a form of governance. And there's a lot of misunderstandings around this. So I'd like to take a minute to really dive a little bit deeper on this point. So Bitcoin has a governance model where you have governance by hashing power, let's say. So the nodes, or the people with the most hashing power, have the most power. Ethereum also has a governance model where you have the Ethereum Foundation, or you have the developers who have a whole lot of say in the technical roadmap, let's say, of Ethereum. You also have other platforms that provide governance to each of the token holders. In other words, if you own that governance token, then you can participate in the governance of the ledger. So every platform has their own way of trying to figure out this problem, the governance problem. In other words, who and how are we going to decide how we make changes to the ledger? And the way that Hedera has approached it is, we believe that the enterprises who have the public trust in their industry and in their geographies should help us in determining what really is the bottleneck for them adopting the ledger. And so the way that we approach governance is specifically designed to address the problems and the bottlenecks that is holding the industry back. And we're not saying that this is the only way. We're just saying that we're approaching it in a way that is specifically targeted for use cases that require the tens or hundreds of thousands of transactions, that require the 100th or 10th of a penny cost. So some of the other points: decentralization is also very crucial. Compliance, laws keep on changing. There's privacy laws that are coming on board. There's also, you know, as I guess a lot of people are listening in from India, regulation keeps on changing basically on a weekly basis, and we don't really know where we stand vis-a-vis the regulators. And so it is quite important also for the ledger to be able to move with the times, in other words, to be able to be flexible enough to be compliant as the regulation changes as well. Now, what do businesses actually need from native tokens? First of all, a token needs to be able to be, or let me just step back. So we need to make sure we allow any developer to define and issue a token. We also, as I mentioned, need to be able to make sure that the performance is very high and that the cost is low and predictable. We also need to make sure that any user can hold and transfer a token. And finally, we need to make sure that the roles of the token issuer, let's say, or know your customer, for example, in order for a token to be compliant, these roles and requirement need to be able to be represented within the token. So we have indeed started to see a lot of use cases in tokenization. And I want to discuss a few of them that really have come to the fore starting about middle of last year. There's some stablecoin use cases that have come on board. Stablecoins are, for example, fiat-backed, let's say USDT, USDC. There's some yen stablecoins that have come online. There's some Singaporean dollar stablecoin. And these stablecoins allow the digital world to be able to be pegged to what we call the real world, the traditional world. And that peg is really necessary, again, for enterprises to be able to come on board and launch use cases. We have a lot of securitization use cases, some lending use cases, specifically in decentralized finance. And a lot of this activity, as you know, is going on in Ethereum, but hampered by the performance and the cost aspects. We have gaming and collectibles. The NFT market is really taking off. Sneakers are being sold for millions of dollars. Art was auctioned at Christie's for, I think it was about $6 million, a digital art piece. Loyalty rewards, and also sustainability. So these are some of the use cases that we have started to see come online, and we believe we'll continue to see be launched next year and thereafter. So for the last minute or two, I just want to go into a little bit more of the promise of tokenization. Right? Hedera has recently launched a Hedera tokenization service, and this service specifically addresses the problems that I have been mentioning. The problem of scalability, the problem of low and predictable fees, the problem of built-in governance, the problem of compliance, and also the Hedera token service doesn't require any smart contracts. You don't need to learn any new coding language for that matter. And so it makes it easy for people in enterprises or even startups to fire up a token in a matter of minutes. And we have many demos available for you to start playing with it. So I apologize. I think I went over about 2 or 3 minutes. But yeah, if there's any questions, I'm more than happy to answer. Thank you so much for your time. I believe.
Thanks, Sami, for the wonderful presentation.
Sure.
Just a few questions, if that's okay with you. So for a lot of years, we have been hearing about private blockchains, and Hedera Hashgraph are working on with enterprises since 2000, like you also mentioned, like since 2016, 17. So can you give us some insights on like what's the status of some, where this entire private blockchain industry is heading with regards to enterprises and startups? In 2020, you are saying we'll probably see in 2021 is going to be the year, but going forward also, like where do you see it going?
Sure. No, that's a very good question. So again, when I started, my background was in finance, for 17 years in finance. I went into the distributed ledger space, and speaking to a lot of enterprises in 2017, 18, most of them were interested in building on private ledgers, right? And the biggest reason was because of privacy concerns, right? And also for performance issues. But I really, we really started to see that change, I would say maybe beginning of last year, where it really clicked for most of the enterprises we spoke to as well, that there are benefits to building on a private ledger, privacy, right? But there's also a lot of benefits in building on a public ledger. And that comes from the decentralization and the trust, right? I mean, what's the point of building on a private ledger? It's kind of like, it's not really much of an evolution from a centralized database per se. So in order for, Hedera has addressed that in the form of, we have a service called the Hedera Consensus Service, and IBM is one of our governing council members. We're working closely with them to create plugins for Hyperledger Fabric. In fact, we already have plugins for Hyperledger Fabric, Corda, Quorum. So the way that we see the space evolving is not, is it a private ledger or a public ledger? It's more, let's use a private ledger if our use case requires that, if there's a privacy requirement. And also, let's use public ledgers that provides us the trust. So we kind of see a hybrid world really evolving. And I think that, and some of the other ledgers, right, public ledgers also look to solve the kind of interoperability between different chains. And I think that's part of the reason why we've seen actually a lot of not just development, but a lot of interest from enterprises.
Makes sense, yeah. Since you brought up IBM, may I ask you about the news that was floating around a couple of like last month that they trimmed down their entire blockchain, teams into to 0 or 1 to developers. Do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, I mean, difficult for me to comment on. I mean, it's you know as much as I do.
Oh, okay, all right.
In the news, but we are. Let me to be clear, we're working very closely with them. They're very active governing council member. You could see all of our minutes. They're published online, and from where I sit, they're as active as ever in the space.
That's good to know. That's good to know.
Yeah.
With regards, so 2021 is going to be year for tokenization in India. We are, like you also mentioned, we are struggling with the regulations a little bit. So would you also say that 2021 is also going to be the year of regulation also? Because now that we are at the tipping point where we have to know either the government is this side or that side.
Yeah, I mean, I do think so. I think, part of the reason is, I mean, this is my personal view, but because we have certain countries that have really taken it. So China, for example, is really in the forefront. Yeah, I mean, they've already distributed sort of their digital renminbi to millions of Chinese, right? So, and that has, I think, caused a lot of governments to really rethink their strategy, right? You have, and there's bigger things at play, bigger macro environments at play. For example, reserve currency status, and with the COVID situation, it's not just become just sort of something that happens, in the blockchain world and some sort of use cases going on here, but you're kind of talking about the reserve currency status, and potentially CBDC use cases are going to be able to circumvent, let's say, the US reserve currency status. And I think that to an extent has really pushed governments to really look at this. And for example, the Indian government might be looking at it a certain way, the Chinese government a certain way. But I do think, and Japan as well, is allowing sandboxes.
Yeah.
So, I do think each government has their own sort of domestic policy. 80-90% is domestic policy, and that is what they're going to be concerned about. But within that, we're going to see, I think, the need for governments to sort of keep up with the innovation, or else be left behind.
Right.
And I think that's a very positive, that you kind of have a fire under your feet, because again, China and some of the other countries, Singapore, for example, has seen amazing innovation. It used to be Japan, actually, when I started. But unfortunately, because of some of the regulation over here, a lot of the talent is now moving to Singapore. So we, as have governing council members from India, and we see India as a very important market. We see a lot of innovation from India, and your especially people in sort of the crypto space and developers are, I would say, the top, in terms of the drive. And creativity. So we're also quite focused in the Indian.
Yeah, that was actually my second question, Sami. Like, would you still continue to keep working with the Indian enterprises, the names that you took, even if the regulations were not in favor? And are they regulation agnostic in terms of working with the companies like Hedera going forward?
Yeah, no, absolutely, right. So I mean, so Hedera is a general purpose ledger, right? You can build, let's say, a currency alternative on Hedera if you wanted, but there are many use cases. There are traceability use cases, for example, right? My father used to be a secondhand dealer in Toyota cars, and spare parts. A lot of spare parts are made in India, made in Pakistan, made in Southeast Asia, and so you don't know if a spare part is real or not, right? This is a real problem that you have in countries. And so that's a use case that's easily taken care of on let's say Hedera or any ledger, where you tokenize each spare part and you make sure that the provenance is written in the ledger. And there's many use cases that sort of don't step on the toes of the regulator, and presumably regulators are very sensitive, especially about monetary policy. But data integrity for us, in other words, the idea of tracking what happened when, and it doesn't have to be, money, it can be anything of value, is one of the most, I would say, vibrant use cases on Hedera at the moment.
Got it. Yeah. So my last question to you would be, what is the first use case that you're most excited about on Hedera? Is it real estate, or is it NFTs? What are you most excited about?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, a lot of that is already happening. So we had DLA Piper, a governing council member of ours, launched an asset tokenization platform called Toko, T-O-K-O, and they tokenized fine art. They tokenized real estate. We had EDF, one of the biggest energy companies that joined Hedera Council the other day, and they're going to use Hedera tokenization service for a carbon offset program. And we're working with a few enterprises for payment applications. So personally, I think payments is the easiest and the use case that really is going to drive adoption.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you so much for taking out the time, Sami, and
sure.
Audience. Yeah.
I hope your audience enjoyed it. I know it's the first session, but
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Have a nice day, everybody.
Yeah. You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.